Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're continuing our Sima Yi's Coup Let's Talk Lore series with episode 6, titled The Battle of Mount Xing. Before we get started, here is the answer to our trivia question from our previous episode, and be sure to stay tuned for a new trivia question at the end of this episode. Now, for our last episode, we discussed Cao Shuang's plan for his attack on Hanzhong as he would set out on the Tongluo path with his army of over 100,000 troops in March of 244. And for this episode, we're going to kick things off first by taking a look at the Shuhan defense and response before closing it out with the resulting battle. Now, at the time, the Shuhan commander inside Hanzhong was General Wang Ping, who had less than 30,000 troops under his command. This was a relatively small force for the Shuhan side because just a few months prior, Prime Minister Jiang Wan actually withdrew with most of his troops out of Hanzhong to the garrisons at Pei County, closer to Chengdu, because of his ailing health. Jiang Wan was the second prime minister of the Kingdom of Shuhan and the chosen successor by Zhuge Liang on his deathbed. And for the last decade since Zhuge Liang's death, Jiang Wan has done a solid job of managing the kingdom. And for the first 4 years, he focused primarily on internal matters as the kingdom abandoned Zhuge Liang's northern expedition approach in favor of internal development. But in 239, with Cao Rui's death and Sima Yi's departure from the Western Front, Emperor Liu Shan felt the timing was right to re-establish the northern expedition strategy, and Jiang Wan was given a northern expedition force and sent out to garrison inside Hanzhong, much like Zhuge Liang did in the past. Jiang Wan personally did not believe that going through the Qinling mountain ranges was a feasible long-term strategy, as proven by Zhuge Liang's numerous failed attempts. So Jiang Wan's preparations within Hanzhong, especially in the later years, mainly focused on a potential naval route from the Han River going east through the Shangyong region all the way down to Xiangyang. Now, this plan was no less complex because it required not only a navy, but also trailblazing missions down the Han River, as the land routes must also be traversable in case of a retreat, since the naval route would be useless in a retreat, as sailing upstream would be quite difficult. At the same time that Jiang Wan was making preparations in the eastern areas of Hanzhong, he did authorize Jiang Wei to continue the Mount Qi path approach west, as Jiang Wei was a firm believer in his mentor Zhuge Liang's approach. But with limited resources, Jiang Wei only had limited success in these last 6 years. But in late 243, Jiang Wan, who had been frail to begin with, started to become unable to continue his task due to his declining health. So Emperor Liu Shan allowed him to pull his forces out of Hanzhong to rest closer to the capital in Pei County. This left Hanzhong in the care of the General of the North, Wang Ping, who now had less than 30,000 troops under his command. The news of Jiang Wan's retreat was known to the Wei court, but the exact number of troops remaining inside Hanzhong was unclear, and this would play a part in the battles to come. Now, by April of 244, roughly a month after Cao Shuang's army entered the Tongluo path, the Wei forces had successfully maneuvered through most of the difficult portions of the path and had reached the Luo River, nearing the end of the path, without any Shuhan resistance along the way. Meanwhile, Wang Ping and his officers were debating how to defend Hanzhong from the Wei invasion, as scouts reported that the Wei forces greatly outnumber their defense. Some officers argue that given the enemy's numerical advantage, they should retreat back into the two interior strongholds of Yue and Han, which were two forts built by Zhuge Liang on the western end and eastern end of Hanzhong. The purpose of these forts was to harass the enemy forces and hinder their advance, while another group of defenders would hold the Yangping Gate to buy time for the main Shuhan reinforcements to come from Chengdu to rescue Hanzhong. This plan works because the two forts were built right next to the Han River, so they could not be starved out, as resupply could be ferried into these forts from upstream, where the Mount Qi garrison was located. Additionally, the Wei forces also could not just ignore these forts entirely and advance to attack the Yangping Gate, as the troops inside could easily come out for raids on the extended supply line that now had to go through the entirety of Hanzhong and cross the Han River. At least in theory, this was how these two forts should work when they were first built by Zhuge Liang during Cao Zhen's counterattack targeting Hanzhong. Luckily, they were not needed at that time. While this plan was logical, Wang Ping disagreed, as he worried that given the short amount of time they had left before the enemy would exit the Tongluo path, they couldn't make the proper preparations by seizing all the civilian supplies and burning down all the fields inside Hanzhong. Therefore, once the Wei forces entered Hanzhong and trapped them inside the forts of Yue and Han, they can then just loot and pillage the countryside to resupply their forces. This would take away one of their key advantages in having the shorter supply line, and furthermore, the closest reinforcement for Hanzhong was Prime Minister Jiang Wan's forces at Pei, which would take at least a month to reach the Yangping Gate. And should the Yangping Gate fall before then, it would then be turned and used by the Wei forces to stop all reinforcements from entering Hanzhong, and all would be lost. So instead of using the two fortifications inside Hanzhong, Wang Ping wanted to march the army into the Tongluo path and stop the Wei forces from ever entering Hanzhong. This was a risky proposition, as aside from being a narrow mountain path, there were no fortifications built inside the Tongluo path. So if anything goes wrong, the Wei forces break through their lines, there will be nothing left to defend Hanzhong. But with the support of his lieutenant Liu Min, Wang Ping got the buy-ins from his other officers, and this plan was put into action, as Lieutenant Liu Min was given a small vanguard force to quickly enter the Tongluo path and start taking up positions on all the high grounds around Mount Xingshi. The goal was to plant as many false banners and encampments in this area to give the appearance of a large Shu Han defense to first slow down Cao Shuang's march. Wang Ping would follow behind with the rest of their forces and encamp south of Mount Xingshi, as Wang Ping wanted to use this mountain near the end of the Tongluo path as the choke point to stop Cao Shuang's army. Despite his limited force, Wang Ping also made plans to divert 1,000 troops to go east towards the Golden Crossing, where if the Wei army happened to have a secondary force entering Hanzhong from the Ziwu path, it would at least buy them some time and be able to block them at the exit of the path. But Wang Ping clearly overestimated Cao Shuang's military skills, as not only are there no secondary routes, Cao Shuang froze when he saw Liu Min's vanguard forces, as scouts reported back that nearly all the mountains around Mount Xingshi had Shu Han banners, and it was unclear how many troops were defending this choke point. Cao Shuang never expected any Shu Han defense inside the Tongluo path, as the mountainous terrain made fighting almost impossible. So with their army tired from their rapid advance past the middle section of the Tongluo path where water was limited, Cao Shuang decided to first rest up his army and organize his lines as camps were made in the valleys around Mount Xingshi. Some probing attacks were attempted, but quickly beaten back by a fierce Shu Han defense, and this stalemate would last for almost a month, as Wang Ping managed to hold off Cao Shuang's attacks thanks to the choke point nature of Mount Xingshi, which helped neutralize Shu Han's manpower disadvantage. At the same time, the extended stay inside the Tongluo path started to create supply line issues for Cao Shuang's massive army. As the weathers got hot in May, the supply team pack animals started to die of exhaustion and thirst as they repeatedly traversed alongside that long stretch of the Tongluo path without any water access. Once the army's pack animals died off completely, the livestock of the numerous nomadic tribes who swore loyalty to Wei in the western area were conscripted for the war effort, but under these conditions, these animals did not last long either, which once again created another rift between the Qiang tribes and the Wei court. Finally, the Wei court was forced to conscript forced laborers from everywhere in the Western Front to manually carry supplies into the Tongluo path. This was not only more expensive, but also extremely unpopular, as plenty of these laborers would die transporting supplies for Cao Shuang's army, who was still not making any progress into Hanzhong. Now, a key reason that Cao Shuang was able to get continued support for his campaign from the Wei court, despite the difficult condition he found himself in, was because Sima Yi did not try to stop Cao Shuang's supporters at court, as Cao Shuang had wisely brought Sima Yi's second son, Sima Zhao, with him on this campaign, as General Xiahou Xuan's second in command. According to the Book of Jin, Sima Zhao's encampment was once attacked in a night raid by the Shuhan officer Wang Lin, but because Sima Zhao did not panic and chose to remain inside the command tent, his unit was able to remain organized as they eventually beat back the night raid. Apart from this brief mentioning, the only other contribution from Sima Zhao in this campaign would be his advice to Cao Shuang to retreat out of the Tongluo path, which, to be honest, a lot of people were telling Cao Shuang. First, there was Cao Shuang's military inspector, Yang Wei, who immediately sensed the danger they were in, as he repeatedly asked Cao Shuang to abandon the campaign. But Cao Shuang's two military advisors, in Li Sheng and Deng Yang, continued to voice their support for continuing this campaign, as they believed they would eventually break through the Shuhan defense. This, of course, was completely delusional, as Li Sheng and Deng Yang were just saying this because they could not afford to allow this campaign to end in failure, as they were the architects and be surely blamed for most of its results. The arguments got so heated and out of hand that Yang Wei threatened to execute both Li Sheng and Deng Yang for treason, but Cao Shuang dismissed him, as Cao Shuang also did not want to abandon this campaign and his chance for glory. Instead, Cao Shuang decided to ask the court for more reinforcements. But officials such as Zhong Yu, who was the son of Zhong Yao and the older brother of Zhong Hui, quickly voiced their dissent, as they can clearly see that the campaign was already doomed, and sending more troops would achieve nothing but more losses in the end. Sima Yi also stepped in at this time, as he would write a letter, not to Cao Shuang, as he knew Cao Shuang would never listen to him, but instead to General Xiahou Xuan, who had a decent relationship with the Sima clan, as his younger sister, Xiahou Hui, had married Sima Shi as his first wife, even though she had already passed away by this time. In this letter, Sima Yi warned him that if the Shuhan reinforcements arrive and cut off their retreat or their supply lines, then all 100,000 troops might die inside the Qinling Mountains. So he needed to snap Cao Shuang back to reality and cut their losses now. At the same time, Sima Zhao also went to Xiahou Xuan, who was technically his brother-in-law, and asked him to retreat. In the end, General Xiahou Xuan and Guo Huai, the two other commanders on this campaign, approached Cao Shuang, demanding a retreat. Now, Cao Shuang was still unable to come to his senses and refused. Xiahou Xuan did not want to abandon his cousin Cao Shuang, so he decided to stay with his unit, while Guo Huai, the crafty old fox of the West, decided to ignore Cao Shuang completely, as he would immediately take his 20,000 troops and pull out of the Tongluo path, citing to the court that if he stayed, then it would only add more casualties to the final tally. Now, if you think this situation is bad, come back next time, as we'll discuss how the Shuhan reinforcements would end up scoring one of the biggest victories in Shuhan history. So hopefully y'all have enjoyed this episode enough to consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this on Three Kingdoms history, or simply support the channel by leaving a comment below or by hitting that like button, as once again, the next episode will be released once this episode gets 300 likes. And as always, I'll see you all then. Bye!